Hope is being able to see the light despite all of the darkness. But when you're living in a world that every day finds new ways to break your heart, the vast majority of Americans say hope is hard to find. American pride in Ronald Reagan's shining city on the hill has degenerated into collective anxiety. From our democracy to the American dream, values that once united us are under attack and feel all but out of reach. Not so, say the bipartisan thought leaders you're about to meet. Armed with humor, they personify the mantra that hope is a strategy that can help heal our angst and add new luster to our once shining city. We start with Miles Taylor, a Trump administration official. He survived nearly losing himself in the abyss and now remains convinced that the arc of history will lead to better days. I'm going to give you the last word because you did allude to it, so I'm going to ask you about it. And that is that on election night 2020, you were alone with a gun. And you nearly took your own life. And you use that now in the book Blowback as a metaphor for where we are in this country. Why?
I was really unsure if I was going to talk about that in the book. And I mentioned losing a really serious relationship earlier, and I'm very lucky. I've now since met and married the love of my life. Her name is Hannah, and she saved my life. And we talked a lot about that, and she felt like it was important for me to go there in the book. Why? Because when I ignored my own personal guardrails over and over and over, there were blinking warning signs as I was trying to go out and shine a light on corruption that I wasn't taking care of myself. Ignoring those guardrails almost cost me my life. And I do think there's a parallel to what's happening with our democracy, that if we ignore those built-in protections again and again and again, it will be what I call civic suicidal ideation. I think right now as a country, if we don't wake up to the fact that these institutions are corroding, we risk throwing it all away. But I'll end on a note of optimism, because I think when faced with the prospect of losing our republic, if it gets that bad, Americans will fight for it. You know, Winston Churchill once famously said something along the lines of, Americans will always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And not long ago, Jane, I was on the beaches of Normandy for a visit in France. And you can't visit that place without leaving with the greatest sense of reverence that the American people, when freedom is in danger, they will give it all up to protect it. And I do think we are in a difficult moment as a country, and I think like in that moment, we will rise to the occasion and will protect the American experiment.
Or listen to Johanna Hayes. Her mother and grandmother were teenage mothers. She grew up in the projects, became pregnant at 16, and dropped out of high school. But she climbed out of the quicksand of intergenerational poverty. Powered by unyielding determination, she finished high school, then college, and then earned a graduate degree. Now she represents Connecticut in the House of Representatives. All right, Johanna, you get the last word. I watched the speech you gave at the ceremony at the White House back in 2016 when you were honored as National Teacher of the Year. And in that speech you said, like many students, I know what it's like to have a dream and to live in an environment where nothing is expected to thrive. I know what it's like to struggle, to find sunlight, and constantly be met with concrete barriers. Too many kids still live that way. You meet them. What do you say to them?
I am them. I am them. So what I say to them, I said that day, I say every day, I legislate from the perspective, that's the way the story began. It doesn't have to be the way it ends. To David's point, you brought up so many amazing pieces of legislation that have moved our country forward. I think we all have a responsibility to keep moving in that direction and not go 50 years back. I tell those kids, you just do your part. And I, as a legislator, will do my part. And to Sohrab's point, all of these grassroots movements where people are paying attention, I am uninterested by Republican colleagues who sign statements or say that they support something. I am more interested in the way people vote on this legislation. So when you talk about raising the wage, there's legislation to raise the wage. When you talk about feeding children, there's legislation to feed children. When you talk about securing the border, there's legislation to secure the border. So all of these things are policy choices. When you answered, do you believe in the American dream? And you said, I have to. I believe in it because I know it works, because I'm what happens when it works, because I have seen too many people who move those concrete barriers out of the way, too many people who use their agency and advocacy to invest in me in the communal way that you talk about, not because they were related to me, not because they would have any intrinsic or reciprocal benefit, but because it was the right thing to do. One of the things with my kids, we studied the Constitution, and the very first part of the preamble is to build a more perfect union. We acknowledge that we are not perfect, but we also recognize that we all have a responsibility, not just elected officials, but every single person, to move us forward. So I do believe in it. It does exist. It is still there. I tell those kids, just hold on. You just keep your head down and you keep working. And I will make sure that I do everything in my power so that you don't have to at least have as many obstacles as I did, or the same obstacles. And at some point, they will take it from here and move us forward for the next generation.
Nobody personifies hope as a strategy better than Katie Paris, the Ohio mother who revolutionized grassroots activism. When the Dobbs decision overturned Roe v. Wade, she got riled up, reached across partisan lines, and turned setbacks into head starts. When Dobbs came down, the assumption was that this would divide into bright color states. The red states would be banning abortion and the blue states would be fighting to protect it. That's not the way it's really played out, because you've had Kentucky and Kansas. Women in those states have opted to retain abortion rights. Talk about how this isn't political for a lot of women.
It's actually been an inspiring year plus now since Roe v. Wade was overturned. Red, White, and Blue has become a community of almost 500,000 women. We doubled in size just last year. About a third of our members are Republican and independent women. And so many of these women, regardless of political background, have come together because they share the personal connection at a deep, visceral level to this issue. And they know when the decision was leaked, we had thousands of women sharing their personal abortion stories or stories of those women who are very close to them in their lives, sharing those stories. And the personal connections formed went so far beyond partisan lines. People saw this as a personal issue, not a partisan issue. And there was a recognition of, my story is mine, your story is yours, and so these decisions have to be ours. They cannot be the government's. And so we have seen a great deal of common ground that goes far beyond blue, red, or purple in shared, in recognizing, having that shared view of those differing experiences. I think something I have learned in the last year plus is that I can never know every circumstance that every woman could find herself in. There are medical conditions I didn't know about. There are life circumstances that I will never be in. There are so many different pairs of shoes that I could never walk in. So the idea of me dictating what exactly the decision needs to be for any other woman feels completely out of bounds for me. And that is something that we have found a lot of connection, again, for women living all across this country, coming from all kinds of political backgrounds. When Roe v. Wade was overturned, the bottom fell out. And there is something very foundational that women thought they could trust that was going to be there. And it's gone. And that has left women really being much more introspective, but also listening to each other in terms of our different experiences. And to me, it's actually led to a really transformational moment for women, listening to each other, understanding each other, and honestly trusting each other more than any politician to make these decisions.
When you're living in a doom loop, it's easy to forget there's more, much more, that unites us than divides us. That's why Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, who's on the front lines of the fight against gun violence, remains relentlessly optimistic.
The first moment of the Trump campaign, right, of the Trump presidency is him riding down the escalator, right, laughable, right? Everybody thought it was this wonderful joke, and yet it was so intentional because from the very beginning, he is choosing to do everything different than every political elite that you have ever seen before. And what's ironic is that when you look at those two Americas you're describing, right, the America yearning for justice, the sort of white patriarchal America, they both have this disdain for elites, right? And so the question is whether there is some commonality, right, between those two, I think, driving political forces in America today, and whether there is an ability to start to stitch pieces of those coalitions together around an agenda that actually does seek to move power from elites back to others. Trump claims that he's taking on elites, but offers nothing that actually substantively moves the dynamics of power around. And so if you want to be hopeful, and I choose to be hopeful, that there is maybe an ability to take those two pieces of current American power at the grassroots and find commonalities.
Vogue magazine, of all places, wrote a piece on you called The Relentless Optimism of Senator Chris Murphy, which talked about your gun safety initiative and mission and work. You have two sons, Ryder and Owen. Does that optimism transfer to where you think this country's going?
Of course it does. I mean, listen, we just spent 10 years building a political movement to overcome the stickiest of American problems, right? The power of the gun lobby. Maybe no more powerful entrenched interest in American politics at times over the last quarter century than the gun lobby. And while we didn't get close to everything we needed, we were able to finally sort of flip that power dynamic. And so, yeah, I feel despair over the moment that we are in, but then I think to myself, I am part of the 0.001% of human beings who lives in a country in which I get to say something about the future of this community, of this nation. And democracy is not lost. It is not gone. It is still often working to our benefit, as I made the case at the beginning of this hour.
Leave it to spirited MSNBC host Simone Sanders Townsend to make a civics lesson memorable and funny at the same time. After her co-panelist historian Nicole Hemmer urged shifting the spotlight from national politics to grassroots activism, I unwittingly set up Simone's punchline, which stole the show. Watch this and you will never forget why all politics is local.
The idea of grassroots local action. There's so much focus on national elections, but if we're going to rebuild trustworthy, functioning government in the United States, it's going to have to start at the local level. And there are lots of people doing really good work on this front. And so I think we need to look at those kind of local green shoots for democracy and think about how we can cultivate those and include those in the message of, you know, why democracy is worth preserving.
You often see at a local level that it's easier for people to get together because they're worried about the same streets, they're worried about the same water, they're worried about the same schools. And there's a lot more cooperation. So your point is well taken. So is the point about state legislatures. I mean, people, they're not sexy. Well, I shouldn't say that, but they're not, you know, well, they're not sexy. And the point is—
You're right, Jane.
What? You agree with me?
I said you're right. It doesn't feel sexy on the outside, but you know what's sexy? Civil rights. I find that very sexy. Freedom. And those are things that are born out of state legislatures.
Ooh, she's good. You are good. It's never been this bad, or so it seems. And at times like this, we turn to historians, almost like therapists, first to remind us that we've faced dark, difficult chapters in the past, then to reassure us that America endured and will once again. I can't remember in my lifetime being in a place where if I saw somebody in the distance wearing a hat that had a slogan that I didn't agree with, I made assumptions about that person. This is a time, because of ideological disagreements, that has ended friendships, it's ended marriages, it's ended relationships.
More friendships were smashed up during the battles over isolationism versus intervention in the late 1930s and early 1940s than even in Vietnam. And one of the things about America that's truly great is that we don't spend a lot of time looking back. But one of the things about America that's really bad is that we don't spend a lot of time looking back. So I'd submit, right? I would submit that actually during the Vietnam era, you would have had that visceral reaction, right? The long hairs, it was the age of Aquarius versus Archie Bunker. You look at popular culture and you see the manifestations of these fundamental divisions. George H.W. Bush, in his inaugural address, talked about how the divisions of the Vietnam era cleaved us still. I could spend the rest of the week doing this. But my point is, we don't serve ourselves. We don't serve the future well. Neither the present nor the future are well served by being nostalgic about the past and falling prey to a kind of superlative hyperbole about our own problems, right? So it's actually not wildly productive to say we've never been X or Y, because we almost always have been. What's productive is to say this is a critical moment. There are features to this moment that could create a country for a long time that we, broadly put, we do not want. So what do we do about it? Well, one thing to do about it is to go back and look at what people did when they confronted similar crises in the past. And at almost every one of those points, the way America endured and the way America prevailed, both for good and for ill sometimes, was by realizing that they'd rather be an America that opened its arms as opposed to simply clenched its fists.
Perhaps no one sums up the stakes better than James Davison Hunter, the renowned sociologist who sees hope as a fundamental human need. You've been quoted as saying that giving up is not an option, that you have to have hope. You've studied a lot of this problem. Do you still have hope?
Well, yeah, because I think that despair is not an option. I think despair is simply not a democratic option. It's not a human option. But we have to realize, too, what's at stake. And what's at stake is that a post-truth democracy is a contradiction in terms. A democracy without some kind of common hopes, without some kind of sense of a common fate, is impossible. We are at risk of losing our democracy. It's important to remember that that some kind of solidarity is essential in any kind of society, but in especially a democratic society. And if solidarity can't be generated organically, it will be imposed coercively. That is a fact. And both the right and the left have that kind of authoritarian impulse within them, certainly at the extremes.
In two simple sentences, Carl Jung, one of the pioneers of modern psychology, captured the essence of healing. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. Some of our most inspirational guests on Common Ground were those who touched us with their candor and courage about how they worked through the trauma of adversity. They refused to stay stuck in the negativity of their past. Instead, they consciously focused on building a new future. And by tapping into the grit and resilience they didn't even know they had, they succeeded. From a Nobel Peace Prize winner to a state senator from Delaware, the women you're about to meet share their insights into coping with hardship. First, MSNBC host and distinguished journalist Katie Tur on how she approached healing her broken relationship with her abusive father. I've heard your father described as a grenade, basically, where he was physically and emotionally, verbally abusive to you and your brother and your mother, even the dog. And you had to deal with that. And how did that work?
You know, it also taught me, we live in this world where things are very black and white. People are good or bad, canceled or accepted. And I think it helped me understand and helps me understand today that people are complicated. People have dark and light within them. And my dad did so many amazing things and in so many ways was an incredible father. And I love my dad. And I had such adventures with my dad. And he was the biggest cheerleader for me growing up and a great role model in a lot of ways. But in other ways, he was scary, you know, and he was explosive and, you know, a ticking time bomb, a grenade. You never knew when it was going to go off. Right. And that was a hard thing to deal with later on in life when I realized that it was not normal, that relationships weren't about screaming at each other and accepting, abuse. It was that a healthy relationship was one where you are a team and you work together and you work through your problems together without one person trying to run over the other. And it made me, you know, I had all this rage inside me and I thought that rage was a driver and I thought it was a distinguisher and it, you know, it helped me get far, but it also was corrosive.
Right.
And now as a 39-year-old with 4 kids, 2 stepkids and 2 kids of my own, you know, I want to be the best version of myself. And looking back, it shows me what I loved about my childhood, what I loved about my parents, what they gave me, trying to take the good from that while trying to mitigate the bad.
Okay, so what you did was essentially break that cycle because so often people who grow up in abusive households, that's what they learn and that's what they carry forward. Yeah. And I've seen these incredible stories that CBS has done on you, CBS This Morning and CBS Sunday Morning, about you and your husband. And oh my God, I mean, everyone should have a relationship like the two of you. I'm serious. It is the most touching thing to watch. And so you consciously set about breaking that cycle.
Yeah, you know, my husband, I got very lucky because Tony had a difficult childhood as well, with a difficult and kind of overbearing or abusive and but also like an absent father. And so when we went on our first date, we didn't have to discuss it because, you know, oh, you had a crazy childhood too. Like, well, we can just move on from there, which was a real relief. Like I didn't have to explain myself and explain my upbringing. And I guess, I don't know, we just click, we get along really well. We fill in each other's gaps. Obviously we're a married couple, so we bicker like anyone does, but there's never a sense that either one of us is in competition with the other. And one of the mantras that we have is that we need to always remember that the other one is doing their best. They're trying as hard as they can. And sometimes things are going to fall through the cracks, but we're doing our best here. And if we don't maintain our connectedness, then everything's going to fall apart.
For many of us, life often feels like a terminal stress test. Then there are people who seem to have boundless reservoirs of spirit and tenacity. They stand on the precipice of disaster and magically seem to emerge stronger than ever. Take Delaware State Senator Sarah McBride, for instance. As the highest-ranking transgender official in U.S. history, she faced homophobia, transphobia, and sexism when she ran for office. But it was nothing compared to the agony she faced when her husband Andy was dying from cancer. Sarah, it actually is talked about that you can have a great bumper sticker, you can have a great slogan, but if you don't have a clear vision of what you want the future to be in terms of change, you really don't have much. And in your case, you ran on something that came from a very personal place, which was watching your late husband, Andrew, battle terminal cancer. And out of that, the issue of the importance of health care and family leave emerged. Talk about that, because you ran on something that people relate to. Talk about why you did that.
When I was running, I made clear that the most formative experience in my life is not being transgender. It was serving as the caregiver to my husband, Andy, during his battle with what ended up being terminal cancer. And during that battle with cancer, Andy was lucky. He had health insurance. We were both lucky because we had access to flexible workplace policies like paid family and medical leave that allowed Andy to focus on the full-time job of getting care that would hopefully save his life. And up until Andy's last moments, even as he faced death, he considered himself lucky because he had access to benefits, to coverage, to care that is far too uncommon here in the United States. We are the only industrialized nation in the world that doesn't provide some form of paid family and medical leave to workers. And so when I ran, I made clear that it shouldn't be a matter of luck. It should be the law of the land. And just this past year, about a year and a half into my first term, the governor signed my legislation, Senate Bill 1, which guarantees up to 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave to Delaware workers, because we can't stop all loss or all pain as elected officials, but we can make life a little bit easier for people when they face inevitable hardship in life.
We're living in a time when transgender folks are being targeted by culture wars. They're being targeted by proposed laws to take away their health care. And you are the highest ranking transgender elected official in U.S. history. And I will ask you the same question, because you were a very successful activist. You worked in the White House. You were making progress doing what you were doing. Why would you get into the mud wrestling ring of politics?
The reason why I decided to run is because I love this community, and it has supported me and sustained me through some of the most difficult challenges in my own life. And I wanted to give back. One of the reasons why I got involved in advocacy and activism in high school and college was because I saw that politics is the place where every avenue of society converges and where you can make the most amount of change for the most number of people in the most number of ways possible. And while, to your point, I was doing that as an advocate, we still, for much of that time, had essentially no out transgender people in elected office, in state legislatures, which is the place where the rubber meets the road on public policy. It is critical that we have diverse voices in government, both because it's a reflection of a healthy democracy. If you don't have the full diversity of a community represented in government, that means the full diversity of that community does not have equal access to all the different ways to participate in our democracy, but also because you can't craft effective solutions for diverse communities if you don't have the full diversity of those communities at the table. It's just a practical reality of policymaking. And so I ran because I wanted to give back to this community, but also because I knew at this moment in the fight for trans rights, while that wouldn't be my focus in the legislature, it was going to be critical to have people like me serve in public office, something that would have seemed impossible just a decade or two ago.
Out of the darkness comes the light. The personal becomes the political, and how we see ourselves can change the world. That's the message of our next two guests, the activist Melanie DeMoore and Mallory McMorrow, a Michigan state legislator. You, from the get-go, were compared to a woman who was called the voice of the civil rights movement, Odetta, and you later shared the stage with her. And I watched a performance of her doing This Little Light of Mine. And she said something interesting, which was that it's not the darkness that we're afraid of, it's the light that we're afraid of. Explain that to us.
Well, that's absolutely true. It takes so much less energy to hate someone. That fear, it takes a lot more energy to maintain your focus on love. It's so much easier to hate. It really, really is. And so that light is something that people have a fear of. You know, they want to stay in the darkness, in the shadows and all of that. But we have to think about all the different things of life. You know, for instance, without the black and the dark, there's stars. And so our job out there is to make our light shine as bright as we can, because we live in a world that wants to keep that light dim.
Turning to Mallory at this point, you catapulted onto the national stage for speaking out against hate speech last year, when you denounced a political opponent who accused you of wanting to groom and sexualize children. Here's part of your video that went viral, which so far has like over 16 million hits on Twitter. Here it is.
I didn't expect to wake up yesterday to the news that the senator from the 22nd district had overnight accused me by name of grooming and sexualizing children in an email fundraising for herself. So who am I? I am a straight, white, Christian, married, suburban mom who knows that the very notion that learning about slavery or redlining or systemic racism somehow means that children are being taught to feel bad or hate themselves because they are white is absolute nonsense. I want every child in this state to feel seen, heard, and supported, not marginalized and targeted because they are not straight, white, and Christian. We cannot let hateful people tell you otherwise, to scapegoat and deflect from the fact that they are not doing anything to fix the real issues that impact people's lives. And I know that hate will only win if people like me stand by and let it happen.
So many people have felt those feelings. They're not as articulate as you are. You became an instant, I don't want to say sensation because that sort of doesn't really capture the gravity of it. For so long, people have wanted somebody to stand up and say what you said. And yet, there are people who say that you were angry. And if you listen to some of the political scientists, they say that you have to be calm and you have to be. Why do you think you got the reaction you got?
I think that for too long, especially for women, we've been told we can't show emotion and we can't be angry. And I was in my community the day after, 2 days after giving this speech, and another mom walked up to me, especially after 2 years of COVID, and she said, "You felt exactly how I feel, and you made me realize I can fight again." And I think there's power in anger, but we have to be very intentional in the words that we use. I didn't at all attack my colleague back. I didn't call her a name. I talked about myself and my values and why people like me, who are generally okay, have to stand up for other people.
Nobel laureate Maria Ressa is a fearless defender of freedom who paid a steep price for standing up to power. Arrested and convicted on trumped-up cyber libel charges in the Philippines, she faced life in prison. In the end, it was the life lessons she learned during her childhood in Toms River, New Jersey, which sustained her through a terrifying ordeal. You very early, your mother, when Ferdinand Marcos came into power and declared martial law, your mother relocated you and your sister to, of all places, Toms River, New Jersey, which seems to me, given what you were coming from, is an incredible culture shock. Talk about how that actually was a formulating kind of experience, influential experience in who you have become.
I mean, the most crucial lessons I think I learned trying to integrate into American society, you know, and Toms River, New Jersey, or at that point it was Silver Bay Elementary School, taught me so much. And I was the shortest, only brown kid in my class. I was put into a third grade. Within a few weeks, I was bumped up to fourth grade. And, you know, the irony, of course, is my third grade teacher is half Norwegian. And she was in Oslo when I received the Nobel Peace Prize. You know, so anyway, what she did was she gave me the very first lesson, which was, you know, always make the choice to learn. So I could barely speak English when I walked into Silver Bay Elementary School, but I was a very studious geek. I was a nerd, and I kept doing all the right things. When she tried to get me to move up to fourth grade within weeks of settling into this third grade, I resisted. And she just said, you know, you have to always make the choice to learn. And you have nothing more to learn in my class. That was the first lesson. The second lesson was something also that was stayed with me my entire life, which is that you have to, whatever it is you're most afraid of, you have to embrace it, embrace your fear. And a lot of that came from realizing that I was kind of holding everything back because I didn't understand the cultural signals. I didn't understand. And so I was stopping myself from jumping in because I was afraid. And I thought, okay, well, whatever that is, touch it, hold it, and then rob it of its sting. It's a lesson from third grade that went all the way to trying to stand up to a dictator. And then, of course, the last one that I wrote about in the book was how to stand up to a bully, replace dictator with bully. And this is something we learned from school, right? In the orchestra, there was a girl, I called her Debbie in the book, but she was always bullied by everyone. And when there's someone being bullied, you don't want to get in the way because you don't want to be the target. And when I reflect on like what we've gone through in the Philippines, it is identical. People stand aside and you have to kind of bear the brunt. So here's this Debbie in orchestra crying because she was being bullied. And I walked by and then I realized I'm not going to walk by. I went and got tissues and it came back to her and I started talking to her. And I realized that when you stand up, you do better together. What happened was the bully who was bullying her tried to bully me and then my friend stood up and that bully was defanged.
So is this the carryover to when you're exposing the corruption and the abuse of power in the Duterte regime, and you do stand up and you do keep going and you're arrested and you're convicted of cyber libel charges, and you now have, even now, it's my understanding, the threat of 60 years in prison still looming in your life, and you stand up. Is that really where it all started? Was in Toms River, New Jersey?
I think this is why I went all the way back. I think it goes back to your values and the lessons you've learned. And, you know, when you come under attack, that's when you realize that you're going to hold tight to what is most important to you. And you go back to what's most important to you. In the battle with President Duterte and with the Philippine government, I always use the phrase "hold the line," because when you hold the line, you draw this line where you decide this is on this side you're good, and on this side you're evil. And it's got to be that clear. So we held the line, and the line for me was the Constitution.
So even in the face of death threats and being bombarded by hate messages, as many as 100 an hour, do you ever say, enough, I can't do this anymore? or not?
I think there are always these moments of, where it punches you in the gut and then you step back and you go, what am I going to do? And in the last 6 or 7 years, I think President Duterte attacked Rappler and me. I was in my 50s. I knew exactly why I became a journalist, why we set up Rappler. I knew and understood the Constitution. So it was very hard. All these whys had already been put in place. And I think what I just learned is that these challenges make you stronger. You have a moment of fear, and then you embrace your fear and you keep going. And because you do, then you take your team with you.
Not only is laughter the shortest distance between two people, humor can be the first step to finding common ground. Some of the most memorable moments on our show have been about more than making us laugh. They've helped us see people we don't agree with through a different lens, without the inflammatory rhetoric that can pit us against each other. From Randy Weingarten, the head of the largest teachers union, who giggled about her wife Sharon, to conservative icon Judge Michael Ludig, who shared a story about how his son helped him make American history, humor's a bridge to recognizing our shared humanity. All right, Randy, I'm going to ask you a question, and we're running out of time, but I know that you're a fast talker. So, you have said you're the luckiest person in the world. You alluded to it earlier, that you work at the nexus of education and the labor movement, and yet you've been through the you've been through the ringer. Your life is not a cakewalk. We've all seen you be attacked. We've all seen what you've been through, and I'm going to ask you the question that I ask a lot of people: what sustains you? Why can't you walk away and go home with Sharon and make, I don't know, kugel or something? I mean, it's just
It's because my wife's a rabbi.
She's a rabbi. Yes, your wife is a rabbi. But I'm serious. What? How?
What sustains me is that the public square, that every single day, or every single Monday through Friday, 90% of Americans' children walk through a school and actually are engaged in learning and actually are engaged in their future. What sustains me is that people see 88% of kids in America, young adults in America, see the labor movement as a way to help them have a future. What sustains me is that we are in the fight for a better life. And so, all these other people, do whatever they're doing in terms of social media. I completely agree with Dana about we need to change the algorithm.
Right.
But what sustains me is that America as a concept is about opportunity and freedom, and public schooling and the labor movement are about helping people get there. And I'll be damned if people stop us from helping people have a better life. That's what sustains me.
Sometimes, especially when you least expect it, the kids become the cavalry and ride to the rescue. Of course, giving them an incentive can seal the deal. That's what happened on January 5th, the day before the insurrection at the Capitol. When you got a call from Vice President Pence's attorney, what happened?
Well, the night that you're referencing actually was the night of January 4th, and that call, the vice president's lawyer just said, "Do you know John Eastman?" And I said, "Yes, I do. He's was a law clerk of mine maybe 25 years ago. Why do you ask?" And he said, "You don't know, do you?" And I said, "No, I don't know." And he said, he's advising the president and the vice president that the vice president can overturn the election, effectively overturn the election a day and a half thence. So I went to bed that night with my wife quite concerned and asking me to do something and pleading with me to stop this. And there was nothing that I thought that I could do or would ever be asked to do. And then I woke up on January 5th, the day you referenced, very, very early here in Colorado, and it was probably 5:30. And the lawyer, vice president's lawyer, called me back, and he said, "We must do something urgently and immediately." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, I don't know what I mean." And I said, "Well, if you don't know what you mean, I don't know what we need to do either." And he said, "We need to get your voice out across the country." And to make a long story short, I tweeted the tweet that I did, saying that the vice president had his only authority and power under the Constitution of the United States was to accept and count the electoral votes as they had been cast and transmitted to Congress, and that the only loyalty that either of those two men had was to the Constitution of the United States. It was not a question of loyalty of one to the other.
Judge, I have to say, you left out one thing, I think, and that is that wasn't this your first tweet?
It was not literally my first tweet, but I did not know how to tweet more than 140 characters or whatever you're allowed. And I called my son, who's a tech kid out in Silicon Valley, and I said, I got to tweet something that's very, very long. And he initially said, "Dad, I don't have time for this. I'm busy. I've told you and Mom that you got to learn all this stuff. You're both Neanderthals." And I just said, "You either tell me how to do this right now or I'll cut you out of the will." And he said, grumbled like all millennials would, and then said, "Open your email box. Do you know how to do that?" And I said, "I do." And he said, "The instructions for tweeting a thread are in your email box." And I hung up and he hung up, and that was it.
And it was the thread that may have saved democracy. I'm sure you think about that.
I do not think of it that way, Jane, but others do.
So often it's self-deprecating humor that cracks the shell of our preconceptions and helps us see the humanity in others. For instance, I never thought I'd hear New York Times columnist David Brooks describe singing a love song to a man. I was wrong. You grew up in a Jewish family where you say that the cultural upbringing could be described as think Yiddish, act British, that there was love in the home, although it wasn't really maybe expressed openly a lot. It was a stimulating intellectual environment, but you all were standoffish, and, it wasn't like a walking Hallmark card scenario, basically. And that part of this mission that you've been on to write this book has been to try and improve or change your own behavior. How is that going?
I think it's going okay. It's halting progress. So I was aloof, and there's an episode that symbolizes to me sort of the way of being I tried to reject now, which is I'm a big baseball fan, and I was at a game, and I've never caught a foul ball in all the thousands of games I've gone to, and I'm at a game in Baltimore with my youngest son, and the batter loses control of the bat, and it lands at my feet. And any normal human being is high-fiving everybody and hugging the crowd and waving his trophy and getting on the Jumbotron. I just put the bat on the ground and stare straight ahead, like I had the emotional reaction of a turtle. And there's a favorite novelist of mine, Frederick Buechner, who argues if you cut yourself off from the pain of living, you've cut yourself off from the sources of life itself. And so I'm not an extraordinary person, but I am a grower. And so I've just tried to learn how to be more emotionally open, learn how to sit with people who are in trouble, learn how to express vulnerability and receive vulnerability. And I think I made progress. I was at a conference a year and a half ago, and one of the things we had to do, we were part of a big group. They handed us over sheets of lyrics, love song lyrics, and they said, you have to pick someone standing near you, a stranger, and sing this love song into their eyes. And if you had asked the old me to do this, I would have spontaneously combusted. But I did it. I could do it now. And I looked at some strange guy's eyes. I didn't know him. But I sang a love song into his eyes.
Do we have that on tape? No.
I hope not.
Okay.
I hope not.
I'm sorry. America is like a dysfunctional couple on the way to divorce court. For 30 years, we've been mired in an endless war that's undermined the concept that we're all in this together. No wonder we yearn for a calm, soothing voice of reason that transcends the political fray, a voice that can instantly lower our stress level. Enter Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and best-selling author Jon Meacham, who's become something of a national therapist. Did you ever consider becoming a therapist? The reason I ask that is because, first of all, I could also say you're like human Google. I'm not sure where that information, you could go on for a week, is mind-blowing. But I have to say that when I hear your voice on the air, you are one of two people who has the power to make my blood pressure drop, really drop. And I've heard other people say that. My husband, by the way, is the other one. But you have this ability to calm people down, which is why I asked about the mental health question.
No, I appreciate it, and Lord knows, as a repressed WASP, I've spent a lot of time spent a lot of time and money with people who've tried to do that for me. I don't see it as. I mean, it's somewhat therapeutic in the sense that therapy is. The root of the word therapy is work. And I do think we have to work at not falling prey to a kind of narcissism of the present, which is totally understandable and totally narcissism and nostalgia are the two enemies of progress, it seems to me. And so you can look back without being nostalgic and figure out, all right, these two or three things worked. And we need to do that. And so let's use the 1930s as an example. So 1930s, which I think is the most like this in a way. You couldn't get good odds on democratic capitalism surviving the 1930s. You had a live experiment going on in the Soviet Union. You had a live experiment going on in Germany and Italy. Anne Morrow Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh's wife, wrote a hugely successful book called The Wave of the Future. And in her view, the wave of the future was not the messiness of democratic capitalism, but totalitarianism. Because, and see if any of this sounds familiar, the problems of the modern era were of a globalized, rapidly moving world was not an 18th century system in self-government with checks and balances, but was in fact a kind of strongman totalitarianism where there would be an ability to move more quickly than the constitutional order gave us the capacity to move. Let me leave you with this. His last Sunday sermon, March 31st, 1968, Dr. King was at the Washington National Cathedral, and he said, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. That's the way God's universe is structured. That's the way the world is made. I'm going to go back again. We are not adversaries. We have to be neighbors. That doesn't mean we all have to be friends, right? I'm not using that word. But we do have to make rational, commonsensical decisions about what we're willing to contribute to a common good that might cost us a little bit of personal gain. And I would suggest that the best eras in American life, the best generations, the generations we should want to be like, have been the ones who have made that calculation.
Jon Meacham, I think maybe in your next life, you should think about that therapy thing. I don't know what, no, seriously. Finally, as we do for every edition of Common Ground, we want to leave you with a silver lining moment that inspires you to believe better days are ahead. Here's what happens when a beloved Disney character, the Little Mermaid, is reimagined to provide a role model for little girls of color. Channel the energy and the excitement you're about to see, and we're on our way to the future we all want.
She sounds like me. She's a black girl. She's black! Mama, she's black! What? Oh. She's black! She's black! Yes, 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 yes!
Yeah, she's brown like you. We're gonna go see it when it comes out in the theater.
Yes!
We're grateful to our extraordinary guests for their insights and inspiration, and to you for joining us today. Until we see you back here next time, from the Frederick Gunn School in the other Washington, Connecticut, for Common Ground, I'm Jane Whitney. Take care.